What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about America? For some, it's the different scenery that one sees when thinking about from sea to shining sea, such as the beaches of Florida or the mountains of Colorado. For others, it's the sports scene, football, baseball, or even calling someone a world champion when they have only competed in the United States. Maybe your thoughts go to innovation, such as the light bulb or the computer, or they go to freedoms that we enjoy, such as the freedom of religion or the freedom of assembly. My first thought when I hear America is apple pie and fireworks on the 4th of July. Maybe it's even an eagle with a shotgun. America as a country, though, has been a major player across the world with a very rich history, especially considering how young the country is as a people. Many countries across the West continue to model their ideals off of our nearly 250-year-old American experiment. But if you know anything about American history, getting to where we are today was not easy. In fact, many sacrifices were made for both good and ill in creation of what we now know as America. And today, our focus will be on the political debate that ended up formally creating the country we know today as the United States of America. I'm Will Henry, and this is Quotable History.
Mary had a savage, quite a soul.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Quotable History.
Here's today's quote. The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, and bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. If you'd like to pause and guess who said this, go ahead and do that now. If you said John Adams, then you would be correct. He said this in a letter to his wife, Abigail. One of the really cool and unique things about John and Abigail Adams is that their correspondence was widely published, and it allowed us a peek into some of the greatest minds in American history and helped us understand the dynamics of the founding of the United States. To understand how we got to this point, it's important to take a step back well before 1776. In 1492, Columbus landed in the New World, or as we know now, North America. It would be 115 years before the British came over with a permanent settlement in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. And then 147 years between that and what we would then know as the French and Indian War. Now, when I was a kid, I was taught a lot of names and dates in history, but a lot of times that doesn't paint a great picture of the experience of being a colonist. So if you're listening to this in 2025, which is when I'm going to post this, 147 years ago was 1878. Reconstruction, which was the process of bringing southern states back into the fold after the Civil War, had just ended. No one listening to this podcast is a Greenland shark or a really old tortoise. So none of us remember the good old days of 1878. That seems like a totally different generation of people. And that is even with us having a significantly longer life expectancy today. I say this because the colonists and British, while there was a lot of loyalty, there was also a large sense of separateness. Many of the colonists were born in America and had never been to Britain. And America was really all they had known. So within this context, there is a sense of being different from the mother country. So now we're in 1754, and there are tensions between the British and the French. And George Washington is sent on a mission and misfires a shot, and the French and Indian War breaks out as a result of this. Now, this war would go on until around 1763, and the British would end up winning, which is really cool. Oh, but it was also super costly, so that really is not all that cool. A Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763, ending the French and Indian War. However, this is where the drama begins. Because of how expensive everything was to keep up with, the British imposed a number of measures that would really tick you off if you had a sense that these people were not the same as you and were just imposing this upon you. It kind of felt like that feeling you get when someone comes in having no idea about a project or something at work and decides to tell you how to do something, even though they haven't really had any involvement with whatever you're working on in the first place. They may actually be right or have a point, but it doesn't feel that good to hear it. So in 1763, the British limited further westward expansion by white settlers with the proclamation of 1763. This measure was done largely to make sure that the British didn't have to protect the colonists from Native Americans out further west. They would also go on to further impose taxes on the colonies in 1764 with the passage of the Sugar Act, which also taxed wine, coffee, textiles, indigo, and a bunch of other imported items. James Otis, in The Rights of British Colonies, asserted and proved in 1764, later the same year that the Sugar Act was passed, first stated the phrase and first really stated the argument, no taxation without representation, as a response to these acts. And this really gained traction. Now, it's also important to understand that until now, the colonists had enjoyed a salutary neglect, which is basically where the mother country, Britain, really didn't pay a ton of attention to them, and there was very little taxation. So this really did feel like a major imposition. They would also pass something called the Stamp Act, which taxed almost all paper, including playing cards. Many boycott efforts took place, which really hurt British business, and ultimately the Stamp Act would get repealed. However, on the back of that, there would also be the Townshend Acts, which would impose additional taxes on many of the goods that I've already mentioned that were very essential for the culture and for colonist lives. Eventually, most acts would get repealed except for the one on tea, and more troops would end up being sent to Boston. The citizenry of Boston was also compelled to pay for these troops, and they really didn't like that. And by 1770, tensions had gotten seriously high. This all really came to a head when a tense gathering assembled mocking British soldiers in March of 1770, and they eventually started throwing things in sort of a taunting way. The British soldiers would then fire upon the crowd, killing 5 people in what would become known as the Boston Massacre. This would really change the nature of further events leading up to the American Revolution. And Boston was about to feel the full force of the British Empire. By 1773, the British passed the Tea Act to save this failing East India Trading Company, and they forced the colonists to buy that particular tea and only that tea. As a response to this, patriots known as the Sons of Liberty would disguise themselves as Native Americans and throw literal tons of tea into the Boston Harbor in an event known as the Boston Tea Party. I was listening to this episode of Joe Rogan where he had on the famed documentarian Ken Burns. And Ken Burns was talking about why they had these disguises. The disguises were not really to fool the British. The British would have very easily known that it wasn't Native Americans committing this act because they had no reason to. This tax didn't apply to them. So why would they do it? Because they were showing that they were no longer British, but part of this land that they had lived in for so long. They were showing that they were other than. In response to these protests, Parliament would pass what would become known as the Intolerable Acts, which severely punished Boston by removing Massachusetts' right to self-governance, it would close the Boston Harbor, and it banned public assemblies not authorized directly by the government. This made the other colonies very nervous. So later that year, 12 of the 13 colonies, excluding Georgia, which was on very good terms with Britain at that moment, would send delegates to the First Continental Congress. In this assembly, they would basically come up with a resolution to ask the British to stop. This is kind of like when I don't want to call a company about a complaint, but my wife pushes me to complain to that company anyway. And many times, like in this case, that complaint goes absolutely nowhere. Much like that example, this did not go anywhere, and it was around this time that local militias who would play an essential part in the future American Revolution began to form. By 1775, the British would see Massachusetts in open rebellion and try to seize militia guns in Concord, Massachusetts. This would all blow up in the nearby town of Lexington, where the Patriot militia would intercept the British troops and run them off to Boston. This was massive. The British Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at the time, would be shaken up by this ragtag group of unprofessional soldiers who were basically just an amateur militia. As a response to all of this, a Second Continental Congress would convene with representatives from all 13 colonies, with Georgia joining in 1775. At the start of this, you really had two groups of people. You had the radicals and the reconciliationists. Initially, independence was not something anyone really quite had the stomach for, but many were more open to taking more radical measures than others. Most early measures were created to give the colonies some leverage in negotiating rights. But on the radical side, this group of people was led by John Adams and others like Thomas Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee. And on the more reconciliationist side, you had those like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and John Jay, who would eventually become a fervent supporter of independence, but was initially very hesitant. Some of the measures that were passed early on was the adoption of the Massachusetts militia and other state militias as the Continental Army, and they would select George Washington, who was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, as the commander-in-chief. But this wasn't initially for independence. Rather, it was to stop the abuses from the British in the colonies. They would also adopt an olive branch petition as a one last-ditch effort to try and reconcile with the British, but the king refused to receive it. And it was at this juncture that independence was on the table. On the one hand, you had John Dickinson and others who were deeply fearful of the lack of sustainability of independence. And on the other side, you had John Adams, a Massachusetts man who was seeing really the full brunt of the British impositions right at his doorstep. And he really had a certain clarity about the reality on the ground. However, while history has shown Adams as the victor of this particular debate, Dickinson's concerns were not unwarranted. He was afraid of going into the unknown and feared the chaos of war. He was deeply concerned about rights, as were the others, but he believed that the reform could take place within the current system. Granted, it would have taken a lot to reform, but it still could have happened within the current system. And with revolution, if you fast forward to the French Revolution, that revolution devolved into chaos, and arguably more rights ended up being lost than gained, and ultimately it ended with Napoleon, a dictator, coming to power. So nothing here was really guaranteed. And I say that to say that John Dickinson's concerns were not unwarranted. This was a totally new thing that they were doing. But many of the radicals saw the writing on the wall. In Massachusetts, rights were being severely stripped and people were dying. They felt like they had no other choice. But the thing with independence was that everyone had to be on board. One person who I have not mentioned here was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin leaned more on the independence-minded side, but identified as a centrist that brought other centrists over. He was also older and seen as a moderating influence. He had attained a high degree of respect due to his famous scientific experiments like the kite and key experiment, but he was also quite the philosopher in his own right. This respect was a huge asset to those seeking independence, and his moderating influence would play a big part in the politics of getting everyone on board. Then on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee would officially propose a resolution for independence. Now, Congress would adjourn before an official vote, and a committee of 5 was formed to draft a statement to Parliament and to the people. And this committee would include people that I mentioned earlier, Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, and also Livingston and Sherman, to write a statement if the vote was for independence. Thomas Jefferson would be assigned to draft the document, which he would commence on June 11th and complete on June 28th. The Committee of 5 would make some changes to the document, but the main question was not really about the document, but was independence going to be passed? So on July 2nd, 12 colonies would vote for independence, with New York abstaining due to the fact that the British were marching on their city, and they thought that if they maybe abstained, they could save their city. However, they would join by July 9th. Eventually, Jefferson's document, the document produced by the Committee of 5, was officially adopted on July 4th. The United States of America was officially independent from the British Empire. It would take an additional 5 years for the war to end and really solidify this independence. But the colonies and their governments were separated, and America was formed. Now, it's important to take a step back and realize that not all of America's problems were solved from the get-go. Slavery still existed, and it took a whole nother war almost 100 years later to be fought over that issue before that would end. Women still did not have the right to vote, and many institutions would still be corrupted. But Frederick Douglass famously would make a speech on the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1852. And he would talk about the promise of America, saying that the ideals were there, even if the issue of slavery was not solved. But the ideas still could be extended to all. Eventually, America would extend the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all Americans. The story of courage, it took so many to get there, from the founders to African Americans and their struggles to women and so many others, continues to inspire so many today. So whether you're left, right, or center, no matter your political views, in my opinion, that's why Independence Day is so inspirational. I'm Will Henry, and thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on this special Independence Day episode of Quotable History. If you enjoyed our journey into the birth of our nation, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review. Please leave a review. That really helps get the word out there. And share this episode with friends and family. Your support keeps history alive. A heartfelt thank you to my incredible wife for all of her editing magic behind the scenes. I really couldn't have done this without her, and want to give her a very special shout out. And to every veteran, service member, and their families, thank you for your sacrifice and service in defense of our freedom. From all of us here at Quotable History, have a very safe and joyous 4th of July. We'll see you next week as we uncover more unforgettable moments from our past. God bless America.